I will take that limitation and roll with it. Okay, so as Roger mentioned, I've been using the QHY cameras literally ever since I first started with the New Horizons campaigns in Argentina. And I'd like to, for my two talks today, I'd like to start with taking a bit of an examination of the calibration process that I know has given me some fits and starts, and possibly many of you as well. So I'll be talking about what it is, how to do it, why we should be doing it, and what we know, or at least what I know about it. And a few words before I start. I'm going to, this presentation generally references the almost latest version of SharpCap, 3.2.6383 of July 3rd. Apparently there's a newer version that came out Wednesday, but I don't know anything about it yet. Every version I reference is 32-bit. I will sometimes talk about other versions where I think I know where certain bugs appeared, but maybe not. Also, much of this talk is educated guesses. Other people may know more. I might be talking about problems that you haven't seen. Your mileage may vary, etc. So please let me know at the end how your experiences differ. I'm very interested to know. And lastly, I'm going to be taking a pretty deep dive and covering a lot of problems here. But if I leave you in the weeds, and I will leave you in the weeds, just know that I do have 3 slides near the end that are a cheat sheet of best practices that I've put together. They won't fix everything I talk about, unfortunately, but they do deal with at least as many of the problems that I'm both aware of and know how to address at this point. And I will, of course, make this presentation slides available via the IOTA site, or however that procedure is. So with that said, let's begin. So first off, what's calibration? For the QHY cameras, of course, it's a on-camera method of finding the camera delay, that delay between actual optical start of exposure and the time-stamped start event, and for compensating for it. So basically making the effective camera delay 0. Of course, want to know that for any camera, even ones with an internal GPS like the QHY cameras, because even then there still could be some sort of, firmware or electronic delay. Best way of finding that out, of course, is some external source like a Sexta system that can time it. But QHY provides an on-camera method that is also optical based that we can use. So first, why would we want to calibrate? Of course, timestamp accuracy is a big deal. The QHY documentation says that by calibrating, we can get down to microsecond precision. That's obviously more than we need. We really, there's going to be bigger errors than that in the rest of our system. But my big question is, how far off are we when we're uncalibrated? And it turns out sometimes that can be a lot. Exposure accuracy is another reason. There are times I've seen where the GPS window reported exposure can be hundreds of milliseconds off if our calibration is way off. Avoiding complete loss of timestamps, this dreaded bad calibration reduce End Pos error that many users have seen. We'll get into that. Frozen timestamps, where the time just does not change from frame to frame. That's another big reason to calibrate. Another reason is the correct settings, the correct calibration point can vary when you change various settings, like exposure, binning, the capture area, the color space, USB traffic, and of course the start and end pause settings themselves. Those are the calibration settings. But if any of these change, the calibration point changes. So this unfortunately is not a do it once, fire and forget. It's something that we have to change whenever settings changes. So I'll review, hopefully this will be a bit of review for those of you that have already calibrated. If not, it'll sort of bring you up to speed. But I also want to share a little of the background of, I think, what's going on when we calibrate. So the calibration procedure is briefly described in the SharpCap help under camera controls, here, camera specific controls, and then QHY camera controls, we hit enter. And at the bottom under GPS controls, the 3 settings are described. But this is the only help that SharpCap gives, and it summarizes it. And when you're used to it, it's the good cliff notes for it, but it doesn't shed all the light that it could, I think, on it. The QHY website has also some information on calibration, but it also is fairly succinct and has the additional drawback for us North American users of being translated from Chinese, and sometimes between the terseness of that, it also does not shed as much light as I think it could. So with that, I want to sort of dive into what I think is going on. So here's a little timing diagram of 2 frames in sequence, because basically, we're repeatedly exposing frame after frame. When this green line rises is when the optical exposure is starting, when we're actually collecting photons. When it falls, we're stopping gathering photons. Ideally, the camera is just dictating the start of exposure here at the vertical sync line, and in a perfect world, the optical exposure would start right away. But instead, there's some sort of electronic gap here for whatever reason, okay? And similar at the end, we mean, the end of exposure might not, the expected end of exposure might not correspond with the real optical end of exposure. So our goal with calibration is to find these 2 points here, the start position and end positions. Basically, the real time offset from vertical sync, start of frame, for the start of the exposure and the end of the exposure. And they are defined in terms of the counts on a 75 megahertz clock. So literally those 2 9-digit counters that you play with in the GUI, the reason the numbers are so big is because 1 second is 75 million. So if you're calibrating a long 5-second exposure, it's 5 times 75 million potentially. So if we're going to find the real optical start and end of exposure, we need a real optical source. So can you guys see my mouse on this here?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So if you look at the open end of the camera, there is actually this little LED, this white thing here to the right side of the CMOS chip, rather. So it's out of the field of view, doesn't impede our exposures, but it still can shine on the chip, and we can turn that on and off when we calibrate, and it lights up. Okay. Obviously, we do this with the camera covered or mounted to the scope so that daylight doesn't swamp the chip, and it doesn't stay on like this still photograph implies. It just blinks once per frame. And to adjust this LED in SharpCAF, we have these 3 settings down here. GPS calibration LED, which will turn it on and actually make it blink, and then calibration start and end pause adjust, which adjust basically just when it blinks. And as I said, those values are just values for a 75 megahertz counter that starts at 0 whenever the official frame starts begins. And another important thing to keep in mind here is that there is only 1 blink going on per frame, but we have 2 different counters to control it. So whenever we touch start pause, it'll switch the blink to occurring at start pause, whatever we change it to. Whenever we hit end pause, it'll change the blink to happen at end pause, whatever we change that to. The only difference between these counters is what the firmware will interpret the time from that counter to be. For start, it'll be start of end exposure, or start of exposure, and it'll interpret it as end of exposure. But either one controls a blink, and there's only 1 blink. And that sometimes can be a factor in explaining some confusing things later. So the procedure says, you want to start with we turn on the LED, and we start with start pause. And the doc says turn it really low, start at 0. I'm not starting at 0 here because there's an issue with that I will get into later, but let's start pretty low. I'm fairly low here at 30K next to 75 million. That's fairly low. So in the timing diagram here, my blue LED pulse is fairly early, and it actually happens to fall before the exposure actually starts. So therefore, in my capture area here, I don't see any LED. We then increase it until we see the LED come on. See, now we see this in our preview, a light shining on it. That's the LED shining on it. In this case, I happen to get up to 70K. And what happens is I get to this transition. I'm crossing the first green line when the exposure actually begins. Since I'm turning the counter up and the LED goes on, I call this an up-on transition. And the up-on transition is when start of exposure happens. That's the first transition we want to find. So great, it went from off to on. I now bounce the start pause counter around, back and forth, play with it until I'm just about settled here. Now my exposure here, you notice my LED is like half on and half off. Okay, so I'm sitting right on the edge of that start exposure. And then to make it official, I back it off so that the LED is just completely off. So the blue line here, I'm completely left of start of exposure, but I'm right up against it. It just barely went off. Now officially start pause is calibrated. So it knows the timing offset of when the optical start of exposure happens. Then we repeat for end pause, but we do sort of do the opposite. we start with an end pause that's fairly low, just above our start pause, because for consistency, we want to increase the counter so that we're approaching it from a consistent direction. Since I now have to go across all of the exposure, I might have to increase it fairly big from 67K. In this case, I'm up to like 40 million here. But again, I'm going to hit a transition where the LED goes off this time. So now when I move the counter up, I'm going off. I'm hitting this down. So then up, off transition is end of exposure. Similarly, we bounce it around till we find it. So it's just starting to go off. And then officially they want it so I think the docs say so it's just on. I don't know how much on that's supposed to be, but for reasons I'll get into later, I make sure that it's completely on. So again, just below that transition point, so it's completely on. There's about a 40 count range where you'll find that the LED goes from completely off to completely on. So hey, congratulations, we're calibrated now. We got start and end pause dialed into where we're supposed to. The firmware knows to apply these offsets to the starting frame GPS time, and we're off to the races. Great. Well, as we all know, sometimes that doesn't always work out. We'll get into problems during calibration later. But first, I'm going to try to take us on as brief as possible, little side quest to explain why I think we've started to have all these problems. So of course, the biggest problem we've seen is this bad calibration reduce end pause error here in the GPS window, okay? And even worse, sometimes we might see the timestamps here will be not just stale, but not even changing, and just they'll be frozen. So we'll get back to diving into this in a minute, but the point I'm making here is that these things started appearing recently. So Robin Glover, who's the author of SharpCap, the software we use, noticed this from a bunch of users, and these things weren't seen earlier. And it seems like by reading the forums that he thinks the QHY software development kit, the DLL, if you're a programmer and know what that is, it's a software that comes from QHY to control the camera, but it is not used by users. It's the software kit that SharpCap uses to talk to the camera. It's an intermediary, a translator, if you will. It seems like that software has changed, and he had to upgrade that to address newer, either to fix bugs from earlier versions and or more importantly, to address new QHY camera models, because he's supporting more models, and that seems to have changed. So it used to be we could set a few values in a few thousand, and we were fine. Now we need to set values in the millions. He also noticed that if we're off, it seems to make a bigger deal now. So this is kind of, I think, the root cause, a leading suspect of the root cause of our problems with the later versions of SharpCap. It's not necessarily SharpCap changing so much as Robin feels the QHY SDK has changed. And in fact, recent SharpCap versions have tried to work around these issues, but as we've seen, are not entirely successful yet. So these changes over the last few months, starting maybe back in January, led to another deep dive of research on the SharpCap forums, where Christian Weber of IOTA ES, Robin, and a few others played with all the start and end pause settings to see, okay, what's the play space of this, and where are the valid values, and how do they correspond to other settings? And they found this nice little linear relationship, came up with these nifty plots, and basically two things came out of that. They found out that start and end pause depended on these 5 settings, which actually QHY documents, and they were able to define a linear regression formula based on that nice plot to roughly predict the correct start and end pause. And the idea was, okay, it goes all over the place, but if we can predict it based on the settings changes, we can at least have the software automatically set it, and we can kind of get out of this morass. So that's what led to the SharpCap GUI changing. If you've ever noticed and upgraded through various versions, it used to be just these 2 simple little controls, and frankly, we never needed to touch them. They were only in the thousands. You set start to 0 and end at 1, and you just never needed to deal with it. Then some additional coarseness stuff got added. And then eventually when it turned out with the later versions of the QHY SDK changed, you needed for full control, and we needed to set it potentially in the millions. So now you can control every single digit because you need to jump over a big range, and you might need to dial it down even to single digits. So that's sort of the summary of what we think is the biggest reason why things have changed in recent versions. Of course, The cynic in me says it's easy for one software author to say, no, the problem lies in other software. But I have other reasons that I won't go into to believe that it really is the QHY SDK changing. Okay, so enough of that side quest. That's just why we think we're having these problems. Now I'm really going to leave some people in the weeds here. There's about half a dozen different bugs I want to talk about. They all interact in strange ways. And again, I will just issue my reminder that if I lose you, there is I will come up for air near the end and have 3 slides that are my ways of addressing these issues. So the first of 6 problems I want to talk about is what I call the End Pos cliff. Basically what happens when we go back to this bad calibration reduce End Pos error that we've seen and frozen timestamps. This error is actually not from the camera. It is SharpCap saying that. The camera might actually be GPS locked at this point. In fact, if you look at my, I probably can't tell because my thing hovers up. Can you see down here where the time at the bottom says 24 minutes? I've had the camera on for 24 minutes. It is locked behind this. But what Robin found was that these frozen timestamps appear to happen consistently when End Pos is set too high. But the camera will still say it's locked if it is. So what was happening was, in some earlier versions of SharpCap, it would say locked, but the GPS timestamps would be frozen. And you wouldn't notice that because we're all trained to just pay attention to status, right? We see locked, we think we're off to the races. So he added a thing in the software to say, hey, if the timestamps haven't changed from frame to frame to frame, strange things are afoot at the Circle K. Maybe the user should know about this. So he added the bad calibration reduce End Pos error. And it means what it says. I think the calibration's off. You need to reduce End Pos. So there's this cliff here where at some point making End Pos too big jumps us over the cliff and we get frozen timestamps. So that's why I call it the End Pos cliff. And most of the time, but not always, as we'll see, we're alerted to this. Great. But the other big caveat here is that this cliff of bad values, and it can vary, is just some point according to the settings where you freeze up timestamps, is right next to the point where we're supposed to set End Pos according to the calibration procedure. It's right near end of exposure. In fact, I am, with this End Pos error here, my last 3 digits are 200. The correct calibration here is like 150 out of 37 million. So we calibrate right at the procedure is pushing us to sit right on the edge of the cliff. So that's why it's a dangerous thing to us, because we are forced to go near it, but we just need to not go over it. So part of my solutions near the end are going to be ideas for how we can try to balance the two. So my solution to this, because we're pushed up against it, is stay away from the cliff. I think we can back down End Pos 10K from the official calibrated value that you get according to the docs. Because basically, if my theory is right, and this is a 75 megahertz clock, what's 10K out of 75 megahertz? 0.13 milliseconds. That's still well under our error budget, I think. And B, the reason I want to stay away from it is, this is a 75 megahertz clock. We could have clock skew. If, we calibrate a nice, 72-degree desk in our house, the camera is at a nice, comfortable temperature. We go in the field and we're at freezing, or it's hot and dewy. These are just probably quartz oscillators. They could drift if it drifts by even 1 microsecond in the field, and I think that's a plausible thing to happen. I'm not an electronics expert, but I'm not surprised if a non-atomic clock can drift by that. That's a count of 75. So if I calibrated to within 50, which is officially what the procedure says, that's 1 microsecond clock drift can push me over the cliff. So I think what happens there is we calibrate according to the procedure and get really close to that cliff, but not over it. And then clock drift in the field might push us over. So just stay back, go back 10K. It's less than a millisecond, The downside to this is it walks into another bug that I'll talk about. The LED for the calibration can accidentally light when you reload a profile. But the upside is at least we're more likely to see it, because if we have End Pos fully lit, we're more likely to see it. But we'll get into that more. Versions that this issue are affected, I think all the recent versions that have the big counters, 6226 and later, I think, not entirely sure. The second of 6 problems. Bad data actually can really mean we have bad calibration and stay stuck. This is insanely complicated, and I will try to not spend a lot of time on it because I will probably leave you in the weeds. But there's a way around this, but it can be really insidious. So we know to look for the bad calibration, reduce End Pos error. Great. But sometimes when we see bad data, it can mean we're actually in the same situation. And if you look again at the bottom here, I've been, this camera's been on for 22 minutes with the antenna on. That's plenty of time for a fix. And indeed, it does have a fix behind the scenes, but it's still reporting bad data. The issue is that 2 different things are combining to generate this. And the less important one, unfortunately, is hiding the more important one. So first, bad data. What does that mean? That is reported by SharpCap whenever the GPS timestamp is more than 24 hours different from the operating system time, from your computer time. SharpCap assumes that your PC time, even though it's not perfect, is probably accurate at least to 1 day. So as a sanity check, if the GPS time is way off, like here, it's 25 years off, it assumes, okay, that's the one that's bad. I'm going to report that. But that's all bad data means. The time is off 24 hours. Here's the important part. It has nothing to do with the GPS fix. Bad data does not mean no fix. It just means the time is off 24 hours. I've seen this happen when I have no fix. I've seen it happen when I have a fix. Now, we usually see bad data at the startup when we have no fix. So we're kind of trained to think, oh, bad data means no fix. I'll just wait for it to get a fix. So it goes to partial data, it goes to locked, and we're off to the races. But what happens if calibration is also too high at the same time as the clock is as GPS is more than 24 hours off? Those are the 2 things: no fix and calibration too high. So the calibration too high freezes the timestamps, but it freezes them at a real old value. And here's the problem. SharpCap sees the 24-hour too old problem as more important than the frozen timestamps. So it says bad data because of the 24-hour difference, not bad calibration because of the frozen timestamps. So we think bad data means no fix. We sit there and wait, but the calibration will mean it will stay there forever until we calibrate. Okay. And as I said, if you look at the bottom there, I've been sitting at this for 20 minutes and it's still setting at bad data. It has a fix behind the background, but the bad calibration down here, because I'm 200, that's too high, is preventing it from showing. So again, to summarize, how does this happen? 2 things have to come together. Camera starts with no fix and bad calibration, both of these together. GPS time is off more than 24 hours because of the no fix, and it's frozen because of bad calibration. SharpCap unfortunately prioritizes the lesser problem, in my opinion, bad time as bad data, and doesn't show you the frozen time as bad calibration. Meanwhile, camera can get a GPS fix, but because it's bad calibrated, it still stays frozen at the old stale time. We sit there and wait because we think we're waiting for a fix, and it never resolves. So what's my solution? If you see bad data, make sure the current settings are calibrated before you sit there and wait, because it might not be lack of fix. It may already have a fix, but it's a bad calibration being hidden by this issue. Another interaction with yet another bug makes this even harder. And we'll see that later. So again, I can pull you further into the weeds. But again, I have fixes for a lot of these things. I think 6226 and later are the things that are affected by this. The third of 6 initial bugs I want to talk about is auto-loading of a profile can fail to set our calibration values, our start and end pos. So whenever SharpCap attaches to a camera, either at the program start or when I tell it to attach to a camera, it auto-loads the default profile if we have one configured. This capture was made just after connecting to the camera, which was already running for some time and had a GPS fix. SharpCap correctly auto-loaded most of my profile, which is calibrated, but it failed to apply the settings down. You remember 150 something? I was like 150 is my calibrated value. These are not my calibrated values. This is the auto preset that SharpCap does. Okay, so that's a bug. It didn't apply that. And because it didn't apply the calibration, I have the bad calibration problem. And if I just hit load profile, again, after the thing starts, then it will actually apply the settings. So it's auto load that fails to load the calibration settings, not manual load. And the instant I hit load profile of the profile that's already auto loaded, supposedly, I go to locked because I was. So this is what makes us insidious. This is the most confusing bug I will tell you about in this presentation. You can have if I had auto loaded this calibrated profile on a cold camera with no fix, what's going to happen? I have a cold camera, no fix, time will be off 24 hours. Auto load bug will mean that it doesn't actually apply the calibrated settings. So now I have a camera that has time that's off by 24 hours and no calibration. Those together give you bad data, but it won't go away. So I could have a perfectly calibrated profile, start up SharpCAF, thinking that it's loading a calibrated profile, and I will get a bad data error that's due to lack of calibration, even though I have a calibrated profile. How's that for confusing? Have I lost everybody yet? Raise your hand if you're completely lost. If you don't raise your hand, I'm not talking enough. So again, we have procedures to fix this, but this one was totally insidious because it's like 3 things happening at once. Okay, so to summarize, you can't trust the profile auto load to set your calibration settings, and it's insidious because you can end up with a profile problem on a calibration problem on a calibrated profile, but it won't even tell you that you're having a calibration problem. Okay, really insane. So the solution, just hit load profile. When the thing starts up automatically, don't trust auto load, hit load profile. The one piece of good news so far is that this bug has been fixed. If we're in 6.3, 8.3 or later, this has been fixed. But all the rest of the problems I'm talking about haven't. So versions. The fourth, the auto presets for calibration values can trigger this End Pos cliff that I'm talking about. Remember these data graphs I plotted earlier where the guys on the SharpCAF forums plotted what's the correct calibration values for various exposure settings, and they found this nice linear relationship. They put a linear regression formula, and it's pretty close. You know, close being within a few thousand out of 75 million. That sounds pretty good, especially since that's, you know, fractions of a milliseconds off. The problem is if that best guess is off too high, it'll kick us over the cliff. So, you know, in terms of an occultation path, it's like saying, you know, we have a tight 1 sigma error, but if the problem is if you're even 6 feet right of the center line, you go off the cliff into frozen timestamps. If you're left of the center line up to 1 sigma, yeah, you're okay. So it can throw us over this cliff even though it's pretty close. So the issue there is when we're playing with exposure, it triggers the auto preset, the attempt to get the best guess of calibration. But if it's too high, it can throw us over the cliff and make the timestamps frozen. So here's the most annoying solution of all. Calibrate every combination of settings that you're going to use in the field. Every exposure, USB traffic, and whatnot, because if you start manually changing exposure, SharpCAF's going to try to be helpful and preset the calibration, and that preset could be too high. This hits me all the time. Almost every time I change exposure, I get bad calibration there because the presets are just a few thousand too high for my camera for whatever reason. So I have like 12.5 profiles configured because every combination of exposure I have to calibrate. This is highly annoying. Again, recent versions, I think, that have the 9-digit counters are the ones that are affected by this. Fifth, this is getting a little less irritating, hopefully. When we load a profile, it might light the calibration LED. Here I've loaded a profile that has my calibration LED set off. As you can see, I have it set off, but clearly we're seeing it. Okay. I've found that sometime, and I deliberately made this appear by setting my start pause high enough that the LED was still visible during exposure. But again, it says off, it should be off, and it's not. So the load profile has some issue where it can leave the LED on. And I'm not sure why. I don't know if this is a SharpCAF issue or if it's a QHY issue or some integration between the two. And this can happen with auto load, it can happen with a manual load. So It can be insidious because you might not see if it's kind of dim. So the solution I have is if you see it lit, you just got to toggle the GPS calibration LED on then off. And it can happen for start pause. It can happen for end pause. It's not always consistent. Another way to avoid this, or to help avoid it, is make sure start pause is completely off, not just partially off when you calibrate. And similarly with end pause, you might see it, but at least if you bring end pause down, which we mentioned earlier, at least it may not avoid the bug, but at least you'll very much see it and be aware of it to work on. Okay, so the last of my first 6 big problems, the GPS reported exposure can be off. If here I've calibrated a profile really low, and as you can see here, I set an exposure of 500 milliseconds, but the GPS is reporting 406 milliseconds. Okay, that's clearly well off. This kind of problem happens basically kind of where you'd expect if you whack the end pause way down. It turns out that that end pause is where it thinks where you're telling it the optical end of exposure is. So I set it way down by 7 million. So basically I'm setting it earlier and it's saying, and I'm telling it, no, really, you think it's 500 milliseconds long, but really it's stopped now. So it's timestamping it then because we told it to. What I don't know is whether I'm really ending the exposure and therefore this part of the exposure is not happening, or whether it's just reporting it at 406. That's maybe a job for somebody with a sexta. This isn't really too bad as long as we don't whack end pause super low. Just make sure you calibrate, and when we're backing away from that end pause cliff where I said stay down 1 to 10K, keep it at 1 to 10K. Don't make it 7 million down. So this is not a super big deal. Okay, my third and last set of problems. Just 2 more things before I get to my best practices. Things that crop up during the calibration process itself. The first is what I call a third transition issue. So going back to our little timing diagram, we're supposed to start with the LED pulse at 0 here. And and that should be before the start of exposure. So the LED should be off when we go to 0. What I'm finding sometimes is it's not. The exposure's already on at 0 and we see the LED. And there's this other little dip in here. There's a third transition. This is the start one. This is the first one. This is the normal end one off to the right. But I'm seeing at the very beginning an extra end of exposure. I don't know how this is happening. So how does this manifest? I set the LED pulse, the start pause to 0. I expect the LED to be off, but no, it's on in the background here. So I'm hitting this area here. I slowly bring it up. I see an up-off transition because I'm hitting this little thing here. And now I'm dark. Okay, fine. Go up again, and bang, I hit my up-on transition. So I hit the start of exposure as I'm expecting, and I calibrate that, and I'm off to the races. The problem I have with this is twofold. One, it's confusing to see this first transition here. Oops, this one, this up-off. It's confusing to see that when you're that low, because that looks like end of exposure, but it's really low numbers, like 30, 70K. The other thing is if my increments, when I go past this, I incremented at 10K at a time here to find this, because this is only like a 47K difference. What if I'd incremented 100K at a time? I would have stepped right over this gap and never known that it even existed, which means I would have thought, hey, there is no start of exposure to be found. I would just see this line, the LED would be on all the time until it's off. I'd never be able to find start pause. So that's real confusing. To me, there is, okay, so recap, it's an extra third transition. My solution for this, I've noticed it is somewhat predictable. If you set start pause to 0, is the LED on? That's the telltale for this. If it's on, you have a third transition issue. You have to go up slowly, like 10K at a time, and find that first, and then you will find your start pause. So that's, again, way back in the beginning when I started at 30K instead of 0, that's why, because I don't know what's going on. It's like the whole frame timing gets rotated or something. I don't know what's going on with that. I'm hoping it's not a big deal because that 47K is like less than a millisecond. So, but apparently the exposure is being turned off for a little bit in the middle of the frame. That's all I can figure out. I think this affects 6219 plus, but I'm not sure. Okay, and my last problem until I start giving you solutions. How many people have had this where the you start going up or down with one of the counters, and all of a sudden the LED goes like much brighter for one frame only, and you touch nothing and it goes back down or off on the next frame, or it goes off for one frame, but only one frame, and then it pops back on. Okay, so here in this screen grab, I have an LED that's half on, and I'm about to hit End Pos, and I'm only going to bring it up one. Okay, so I'm at 97 down here. I'm about to bring it up 1 to 98. So I would expect the LED to get a little dimmer because I'm should be going off the edge. Instead, what happens? It goes brighter. And what's weirder is I now touch nothing, and it goes dimmer again. Remember, I'm still on 98 here. This is before 98, after 98 goes dim. Weirdness, right? So I think what's happening here is just a simple little double exposure. I actually lied in this example, or at least misled you a little bit. I was really at start pause before I hit end pause here. So I was really, the LED was at the beginning of exposure because I was nearly calibrated. So this half lit was from start pause. Now in the middle of the exposure, I'm about to hit end pause. So I've already exposed to the start blink. And still on frame 2, I hit end pause, and bam, now I set the blink to end. Because remember, I said there's only one LED blink. It's just that we can control it with 2 different counters. So I made it jump basically into the future. And I'm still on the same frame. So I double expose is all this is happening. The same frame 2 that was exposing, I had the LED from the past where it was already hit the exposure. I made it jump to the future, and it got double exposed. And the reason it magically goes away is the very next frame, we start afresh, and we no longer have the after image of the start pause blink because now there's just the one blink. So basically, this is just either double or non-exposure. Sometimes if we jump, make the LED increment go up, it'll get double exposed because we jump from the past where it's already exposed to the future where it'll be exposed again. And if we go down from the future to the past, we go from the future where it has not been exposed to the past where it can't be exposed, and we don't see the LED. And again, just for one frame, next frame starts all over and sees it. Who cares? Just ignore it. It's just a little idiosyncrasy. But at least I think I understand what's going on. Versions, again, all the latest versions, I think. Okay, so now it's time for everybody to wake up from and get out of the weeds that I have dragged us into for the past half an hour. These are, I think, solutions to these problems as best I know how so far. So a few tips while calibrating first to bring out my best practices. I like to set the gain up when calibrating so that I can see the LED better. Recent SharpCap versions will do this for you. I think from 6232 on, they will whack the gain up to 480 when you turn on the LED, and then they will nicely turn it back down. But yours may not, so it's something to keep in mind. Display histogram stretch can be your friend. You might think, hey, the LED is not visible here. I have it turned on. I must be out of exposure. But really, if all I did was change the histogram stretch, and really, I'm partially on here. So that also can be your friend. And again, neither of these settings affect calibration. So playing with the gain, playing with histogram does not affect calibration. If you're calibrating a small region of interest, okay, it usually defaults to the middle of the frame, right? Well, the LED, as we saw, lights up the right side of the frame, so sometimes you may not see it. So for an ROI, slide it off to the right so that you can see the right edge of the frame. So to summarize, my 3 best practices while calibrating: hit the gain up so you can see it. Just make sure you turn it back down so you don't save it like that. Display histogram stretch as your friend, and slide ROIs to the right. Again, moving the ROI does not change a calibration value. Changing the size will. That's a capture area thing, but moving it does not affect your calibration. Okay, second of my 3 last slides, or almost 3 last. Some configuration stuff to do at home to try to mitigate all these problems. First, if you're using the recent versions of SharpCap, upgrade to 6383 or later, because that at least fixes one of these bugs, the auto load not setting your profile values. Unfortunately, we got to make calibrated profiles for every exposure combo we use because the auto preset of when changing exposure can be wrong. And that's, if we change any of these settings, you need to make a calibrated profile for it. I know it sucks, but it avoids the bugs we have currently. And it especially can avoid the bad calibration error and frozen timestamps, losing our timing data. When you are calibrating, look for that third transition issue. And again, the way to find that is setting start pause to 0. If the LED is on, you have to look for it with small steps before you then find your true start of exposure. Leave the start pause below the calibrated value. So when you get it down below, so it's just off, what the docs say, throw it another 10K off. Again, doesn't affect accuracy, less than 0.2 milliseconds, but it may avoid the light LED bug. This is probably my most important suggestion. Leave End Pos 10K below the calibrated value. Again, I will say leave End Pos 10K or so, maybe even more, below the calibrated value, because again, it doesn't have much accuracy effect, I think. It's less than a millisecond, but it keeps us away from the cliff more of frozen timestamps and losing our data. And that clock skew in the field that I suspect could be happening could be pushing us over the cliff. But if we have a bigger buffer, we can deal with that. And as a bonus, it'll alert you to another bug that's still there. You'll see the LED brighter if it actually gets accidentally lit, so you'll know to turn it off. And of course, just sanity check, make sure the LED is turned off in the profile and gains back to 100, 300 before saving the profile. So these are my best practices for before I go out in the field to set up all my profiles and stuff. My last slide of best practices in the field. Okay. Don't trust auto load. Load your profiles manually. Thankfully, if you go to 638 years later, this has been fixed. Only capture from a freshly loaded, calibrated profile. Don't tweak the settings later. If you need to tweak exposure to see if you can see the star or not, great, play around, but go load a profile that has that exposure that's already calibrated before you capture. That avoids the presets that get triggered when you hit exposure from messing up your calibration. Keep an eye on the preview to see if the LED is lit. I've had this bite me, where the profile load may accidentally light the LED. You have to toggle the LED off if that happens. And last, of course, watch for the signs of bad calibration. We all know this one, but now we've learned this one can strike us. Bad data could mean we don't have calibration as well. So always manually, not automatic, manually load a calibrated profile before sitting and waiting for bad data to go away. Look for frozen GPS timestamps that don't update. Sometimes we get an error for this. I think in older versions, we might not. Watch for the exposure to change. I don't think it will hit this one unless you have really bad calibration. So those are my 3 big slides. And again, this presentation will be available, so you don't have to furiously scribble notes, because I know I've probably put you guys to sleep. Okay, second to last, future things I'd like to see worked on. More accuracy checks. Obviously, this has been sexted by Mark Bowie and Christian Wiebe and a few others, but what version were they using? And I'd like to explore the calibration space more. Is my hunch that 10K is only a 0.13 millisecond error sufficient? Can we start bringing End Pos down in steps, 100K at a time, and see is it really on that 75 megahertz clock, and is it like a somewhat linear relationship between accuracy and End Pos? Does it change with versions? When exposure reported in the GPS window goes down, is that a real thing? Is it just changing the timestamp, or is the real optical exposure going down? I don't know. And lastly, my big wish list that I want to talk with Robin about to fix things. Obviously, I'd love all this to just go away, but we got to deal with what we know. And I think I have some solutions to help us work around these issues. And one is I would like him to add the ability for us to adjust his formula for the start end preset. So whenever we change exposure and it tries to helpfully set the calibration values, there's a formula, like a y equals mx plus b formula. I want to toggle m and b, because while it's pretty close, it's going too high. And I want to just keep it away from that. So I want to shift the whole line so that nobody ever crosses to the right side of the center line, even if they're within 1 sigma, because that can kick us over the cliff. I think this fix alone will allow us to just tweak the formula one time in global settings and be done with it. I think that will, as Michael Corleone says, answer all our questions and solve all our problems. Barring that, I want to have the ability for SharpCap to auto-tune the End Pos. If it knows enough to say bad calibration, reduce End Pos, it's saying reduce End Pos, then go ahead and reduce End Pos. Okay, just automatically bring it down if you see the error. Maybe that'll help. I want it to keep an eye on frozen. Well, it already is keeping an eye on frozen timestamps, but always report them as bad calibration, because that's what they are, and that's the worst problem. Don't report them as bad data sometimes, because that leads us into thinking we need to wait for a fix, which may not be the problem, but we don't know. And it should also keep an eye on GPS exposure. If it differs, maybe alert us to that. And of course, a fix for that, light the LED bug. Lastly, and yes, this is my very last slide, a couple of references I found useful. The SharpCap forums are really good, especially this super long thread on calibration issues. Christian Weber's IOTA ES Berlin workshop had a lot of good information for me, especially his second day slides on calibration itself. I gleaned a lot of information from that. QHY has some talks on calibration, but as I said, they sometimes confuse me more than they help. And lastly, everybody that has talked to me over the mailing list and on the Zoom seminar, Joan Dunham, Roxanne Kamen, John Moore, and a bunch of others, thank you for your input. I don't know if I have led people to have more confusion or if I've solved any problems, but certainly your input has helped me in my understanding of this. So with that, I'll take a breath and take any questions.
Yes, Kai, what does this mean for every observation I've made when I was back on 3.0 or 3.1 version?
I think here's the other thing is, now that you've sit and listened to me drone for 45 minutes, I think the other solution here is just go back to 3.1 or an early 3.2. This seems to be that I think the QHY SDK changed. Now, Robin has also admitted that he says it might also be that I didn't know as much about the QHY cameras when I started writing SharpCap. So I don't know if it's 6 of one, half dozen the other. I suspect it's more of a QHY DLL problem, because I've dug down on this even further. I've set up a debugger and watched the API calls that SharpCap's making, and they don't appear to change from SharpCap versions that seem to be fine and versions that aren't. I mean, there's some changes, but I think he's adapting to the QHY DLL problems. And he's setting the same values. Remember, those early versions had calibration values of a few thousand, and now they need a few million, but he's making the same call with the same value. So I think it's the QHY driver has changed. But to answer your question, I think our old stuff is fine, because especially since it's closer to a version that was sexted by Mark. And we have not seen, bad calibration errors in the early ones. If you have, let me summarize. If you have a version where the calibration things are only like 0 and 1,000, and you've never touched them, and it's never complained, and you've never seen the LED on, I think you're fine. Anybody else? Okay, so as I said, I'll put this presentation up. It's really just those last 3 slides of procedures. I have not had problems since I've done that. It's unfortunately some work, and it's annoying. But as I said, I think with some work on SharpCap that we can get back to both stability and not so much work. But as I said, if I follow those procedures in those 3 slides, I have not had problems since with the latest versions. Okay, since I appear to only...
I had a question.
Shoot.
So does anybody know, or has it been documented, what's the dead time between the end pause and the next frame start pause?
That's good. I want to say that Mark found it to be only like a millisecond or 2, or within the margin of error of the sexta. I suspect that it's on the order of that 47K. When I found that third transition, I find that the second fake end of exposure, which probably really is an end of exposure, that the whole timing sequence is getting like rotated, and that it's like a 47K on that 75 megahertz timer, which would be sub millisecond. But I don't know that supposition. I would love to see that, A, to know it in general, and B, I really want to know it when I'm hitting that third transition issue, because that, is that really shifting the exposure around? Is it exposing twice?
Yeah, so, but if the dead time there is only a couple of milliseconds, it's really outside the realm of what we're doing with our occultation astronomy.
Right.
Because, we're not getting results to that level of detail.
Yeah.
So I think that in practice, people probably wouldn't need to hyperventilate over all this stuff. All they'd have to do is set a start pause like 0 and an end pause that doesn't cause you that error, and let it go. Just run.
Right. I think so too. The issue though is that End Pos is linear with exposure. So with longer exposures, if you double your exposure, End Pos gets doubled. And the more off End Pos is, yes, if it's low, it'll stay away from the cliff of total chaos, the cliffs of insanity, but it will also make the reported exposure go low. And what I don't know is does it also bring down the real exposure? So we still have to have the fixed in sharp cap of the guess for End Pos, which is close but no cigar, needs to just back off from the cliff, and then I think we're golden.
Yeah, those things need to be determined. I know that Bob Anderson did some testing of this camera, and he did it at different exposures and stuff. I don't think he found any major problems using his ArtStar device, but that was a couple of years ago, so I forget.
Right, that's the whole. I think we have a whole new can of worms now with these later versions.
Yeah, well, great work, Kai. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thanks.
Sure. Okay, now let's.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, shoot.
I was wondering about the control of the LED. It must switch from the start pause adjustment to the end pause adjustment. And I've noticed some odd behavior. I wonder if there could be bugs or trickiness of that might have caused that 0 LED light condition.
Yeah, I don't know. I've noticed it get real egregious on a USB 2 desktop machine. I've had that transition be like in the millions. Like I've had it shift the start of exposure like well into the frame range and make my End Pos like 1.5 times what it should be. I haven't explored that much because it's an old machine that's USB 2 that I don't know, but it kind of threw me for a loop. Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, this is Art. If someone needs something like a Sexta, one of my Arduino devices acts just like it. I call it Time Analyzer.
Okay.
You can make it for about $75 and put the parts together in less than an hour. So I think it has similar precision and accuracy. So give that a look if you're interested.
Oh, excellent. And I can get both. I can determine, so it's tied to PPS, so I can get both start of exposure accuracy and length of exposure accuracy?
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, excellent. Okay. I will investigate that because I would like to play with something like that. Anyone else? Okay.
Hey, I'll just comment. For the first time I saw the LED light come on, something froze and I had to restart SharpCap, and it came up with the LED, exactly that pattern that you see. And I was thinking, is that Jupiter? What is that? And then it dawned on me it was the calibration LED.
Yeah.
And I know that because of that last Zoom meeting we had. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known it.
Right. Yeah, and as I've noticed, it can come on even if the GUI says it's off when a profile loads.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, if there's nobody else, I'll try to compress my next presentation down